Thank you very much for having me. So this is actually very good to come after Rocco, as it's very related to his work. So this is joint work with Justin Pierce, Georg Schauer, and Peter Schott, and the usual census disclaimer applies. So expanding global value chains have increased world trade and prompted convergence between poor and rich countries over the last decades. However, the recent trade restrictions that have been discussed already this morning put the global value chains at risk and threaten some of this trade growth and convergence. So in this talk, what we want to understand is how a rise in tariff uncertainty might affect firms in trade. So in particular, we examine the impact of increased tariff uncertainty on firms' ability to solve a quality control problem with their foreign suppliers. So you could think of GM trying to source some car part from abroad, and the supplier can either ship a high quality input or they can shirk and deliver low quality to GM. And GM is trying to ensure that the product is of high quality. So we're going to study two procurement strategies that are often mentioned in management surveys that we have just discussed already, that have been mentioned as solution to this quality control problem. So under the American system, firms simply buy on the spot market from the cheapest supplier and then perform costly inspections to make sure that the input is of good quality. And under the Japanese system, instead, they form long-term relationships and then pay incentive premia to their suppliers. So in terms of what we do today, I'll first briefly walk you through the theory. So we also build on a model of Taylor and Wiggins model of domestic procurement. And this model is very appealing because it generates American and Japanese style procurement as optimal outcomes to a quality control problem. The main bulk of the talk will then be the data. So we go to transaction level US import data, and we show that we can actually detect this American and Japanese style procurement among US importers using observable variables such as shipping frequency and prices. And then we analyze reactions of US importers to a reduction in trade policy uncertainty with respect to China that led to a shift to the Japanese system in the early 2000s. Finally, we embed our model into the general equilibrium framework of Eaton and Quantum, and we use this model to quantify the welfare implications of shutting down Japanese procurement, for example, as a result of a big increase in trade policy uncertainty. So let me start going through the model. So given the time constraints, this section is going to be quite brief before going to the data. So existing models in trade usually feature integration as solution to firms' quality control problem. So here we're going to focus on an alternative that is in particular relevant for cases where integration may not be possible, for example, because of ownership restrictions, such as in China, or also in the US and other Western countries more recently in certain sensitive sectors. So in this model, as I said, which is built on this Taylor and Wiggins, a buyer has to order an input from a supplier without observing the quality of this input ex ante. And so the buyer has to choose an optimal order pattern, payments, and inspections. What this model delivers is that the optimal contract is one of two strategies. Under the American system, the buyer simply chooses the lowest cost bidder in the spot market and then pays a fixed inspection cost with some probability to deter cheating. So you can think of this fixed inspection cost as you have to rent a warehouse and then you use this warehouse to inspect however many units of the inputs that you're receiving. And sellers have no bargaining power, so they're just receiving marginal cost in this model. Instead, under the Japanese system, there's no inspection, but the buyer instead pays an incentive premium in this long-term contract to deter cheating. And so the prospect to be able to collect this incentive premium into the future is what motivates the supplier to ship high-quality goods, because they know that they'll get these profits as long as they keep shipping high-quality inputs. Our contribution is to generalize this model to international procurement. And in particular, in our model, there will be trade wars that arrive at some exogenous rate rho, and they break relationships. So you can think of this as an increase in tariffs to such a high level that these relationships are no longer viable. And later, we'll also embed this model into G. Relative to the original Taylor and Wiggins, we make one simplification. We assume that inspection always occurs in the American system. This is to be able to derive analytical results in our extended model. So just to give you a sense of the setup, let me just spend 2 slides kind of explaining a little bit the details of the model. So there's a buyer firm that wants to source some fixed quantity Q that we take as given for now, but endogenize in the GE model. And they're going to order this in a series of symmetric shipments of size X that the buyer can decide over time interval from some homogeneous suppliers. So we kind of illustrate this here in this diagram. On the x-axis is time, And on the y-axis is the buyer's inventory. Say this buyer wants to source 5 units of input over a time period of 1, and say this buyer chooses to get this in 5 orders, then they would order the first unit, inventory jumps up to 1, then they sell off this inventory, then the second order arrives, the inventory jumps up to 1, and so on. And there are 5 orders in total. So these orders arrive 1/5 time units apart. Now, what the buyer has to do is they have to choose the optimal system, either American or Japanese, and an order size X to minimize the present discounted value of costs. I don't have time to go through all the details, but basically the intuition is that these costs are very different. Under the American system, the buyer's costs look like this. So they pay a cost per unit of high quality, theta upper bar, times X. These are the variable costs. There are some fixed logistics costs that they have to pay, like logistics at support and so on. And finally, there's a fixed inspection cost that they pay to inspect. Under the Japanese system, there's the same variable costs and the same logistics costs, but instead of these fixed inspection costs, there's an incentive premium that they pay that is proportional to this trade war arrival rate and the frequency of shipments. So what this model generates is basically a trade-off between this fixed inspection cost and this variable incentive premium. And this race between fixed and variable costs is what determines which of the two systems to use. This model generates 2 sets of implications. First, we can show that we can actually use some observable variables to distinguish between American and Japanese style shipments. So under the American system, order size should be larger than under the Japanese system. So orders are kind of bulkier, arriving more time apart, because the fixed inspection cost under the American system implies that you want to economize on these fixed costs and you want to spread them over more units. So you're going to order less frequently so that you can really use up this whole warehouse that you have to inspect these goods. Instead, the incentive provision under the Japanese system implies that you want to order more frequently in order to pay this incentive premium relatively more frequently to the supplier. So the order size is bigger under the American system. Second, the price is going to be higher under the Japanese system than under the American system because you have to pay this additional incentive premium under the Japanese system to motivate the supplier. The second set of implications is about trade policy. So the cost of Japanese procurement depends on the arrival rate of trade wars, which break relationships. So sellers are going to discount their profits, and not only in terms of their rate of time preference, but also based on their policy beliefs. So if they think that a trade war is relatively likely, they're going to think that the relationship that they are promised with their buyer is not going to last for a very long time period, and that's going to make this Japanese system relatively unattractive. Instead, the cost of American-style procurement is independent of policy. You just buy from the spot market. And so a lower probability of trade wars is going to lower the incentive premium. If a trade war arrives at a lower rate, it means that the expected relationship duration is greater, and that means you have to promise a lower incentive premium to the supplier to meet his participation constraint in this relationship, because they know that they're going to be able to collect this premium for a longer time period. Now, if you start out in a world where you source from the American system and the probability of a trade war falls sufficiently, it's possible that the optimal system switches from the American system to the Japanese system. And if that happens, what we should see is that the order size falls as we go towards more kind of just-in-time procurement, and the price rises because of the payment of this incentive premium that is necessary under the Japanese system. So we're going to test these 2 sets of implications in the data. So we're going to use fairly standard US import transaction level import data from the Census Bureau, covering the universe of import transactions between 1992 and 2016. In this data, we observe the identity of the US importer and the foreign exporter, as well as the date of the foreign export and US entry, the value shipped, the quantity shipped, and 10-digit HS product codes. As mentioned, we're going to analyze arm's length transactions. And we're going to look at shipments with the narrow importer by product by country by mode of transportation bins to isolate obvious sources of variation. So if we compare 2 importers, one is buying shoes and one is buying cars, obviously they're going to pay different prices and have different shipment frequencies just because they're ordering different products. And so we want to control for some of these sources of variation to really narrow down the analysis to the shipping system. In some cases, we're also going to examine what we call quintuples that also take into account the exporter dimension. So these are kind of importer-exporter relationships for a given product, country, and mode. So the first exercise we do is we're going to try and classify importers as American versus Japanese. And kind of just as Rocco already mentioned, there's this nice measure that we developed. Basically, American buyers, according to the model, receive shipments from many different sellers since they just get the cheapest one on the spot market, whereas Japanese buyers receive shipments from a single seller in a long-term relationship. And so what this means is that we can go to the data and we can compute the ratio of the number of suppliers used divided by the number of shipments for these quadruples that we look at in our sample. So through the lens of our model, if a buyer uses more suppliers given their number of import transactions that we see, so they have a higher SPS, then those are more likely to be American. So just to give you a sense of how this SPS looks like in the data, I'm plotting here the kernel density of SPS across these quadruples. And we're conditioning on quadruples with at least 5 transactions so we can actually identify the system that they're using. So if SPS is relatively high, so here to the right, these are quadruples that look like they are more using the American system. They're closer to using a unique seller for each shipment. Whereas quadruples here to the left, these look more Japanese. They're using one seller for many different shipments. Just to get a little bit more of a sense of this measure, we're going to just compute some statistics for this measure. So we're going to compute this ratio of SPS by country for 2 different time periods, so 95 to 2000 and 2002 to 2007, just to look at, well, what countries are shipping to the US relatively more under the Japanese system, and what products are relatively more under the Japanese system in our data. So here I'm just showing you the mean SPS measure for these 2 time periods for exporters shipping to the US from different countries. And this is ordered by the first period's level of SPS in ascending order. So what we see is that imports from Japan look relatively more Japanese. They have one of the lowest SPS ratios that we see in the data. Only Mexico has a lower ratio. This could be because a lot of car manufacturers are ordering from there and have plants in Mexico. But it's reassuring that imports from Japan do look relatively more Japanese. Another important country that we're going to come back to is, for example, China. At the start of this sample, they had a relatively high SPS ratio, kind of indicating relatively more American-style sourcing, but they have one of the highest declines in this ratio across time, and we'll come back to that point. If we look at products, we see that transportation equipment is one of the most Japanese products. These are cars, basically. So those are usually sourced now under the Japanese system. Whereas if you look at textiles or minerals, those seem to be relatively more under the American system. We have more on this in the paper. We also look at different industries and so on. But let me move on to the key exercises. So the first thing we want to do is we want to see whether SPS actually is a good measure of classifying these transactions into the different procurement systems. So our model suggests that American-style buyers receive larger shipment less frequently and at lower prices. And so we can test this in our data by basically running a simple OLS regression where for each quadruple, we compute the average shipment size, shipping frequency, or the average unit value. And we just regress this in this regression on our SPS measure of this quadruple. Consistent with the model, we also control for the total quantity ordered. So this is kind of like holding this Q fixed in the model. This is just going to be the total quantity that this quadruple buys over the entire lifespan divided by the number of weeks. This is kind of just so we compare quadruples that have a similar size. We don't want to compare a quadruple that imports $1 billion to a quadruple that imports $1,000 because there could be differences just because of the size. And we also control for when this quadruple is trading. So we have here control for the first week in which we observe the quadruple and the last week in which we observe the quadruple. These are just integers, like the first week in 92 is week number 1, and then we just keep counting. This is just, for example, the average price because of inflation could change over time. And so this is kind of picking up time effects. And then finally, we have a product, country, mode of transportation, fixed effects. So what we're comparing here is, say, GM and Ford. They're buying the same product from the same country using the same mode of transportation. They're buying the same total quantity, but one of them is using more suppliers given the number of transactions. And so what we want to see is whether the firm that's using more suppliers, do they behave relatively more American style? Do they have lumpier orders at lower prices and so on? So we run this regression, again, controlling for the total quantity, and we do find kind of consistent results with this SPS being a good measure. So we find that if you have a higher SPS measure, you tend to get a higher quantity per shipment, And these shipments are spaced out more, so the weeks between shipments measure is greater at lower prices. So that's kind of consistent with this idea that a greater SPS is indicating more American-style procurement. In the paper, we do a couple of other analyses. We also show that higher SPS is correlated with a shorter relationship length. We also show that a higher SPS is correlated with with less differentiated products, so with more commoditized products, whereas more Japanese-style sourcing is more differentiated products. The second thing we do is we go to the firm level. As Rocco mentioned, the firm level is an important determinant of these sourcing strategies. And we want to see whether firm level attributes are also correlated with the average SPS that the firm is using by basically just aggregating this SPS to the firm level. And what we find is that more American-style sourcing is indeed associated with greater inventory. So that's also consistent with this idea that American-style system means that you're getting bulkier orders and then you put it in inventory until you sell it off. It's also associated with smaller firms in terms of their sales and in terms of their total payroll. The second thing we want to do is you want to analyze this change in trade policy uncertainty with respect to China. So this is a well-known kind of trade shock. So let me just walk you through relatively briefly. In October 2000, the US passed permanent normal trade relations with China. This was a change in policy that eliminated a threat of sharp increases in US import tariffs on Chinese goods. And we're going to use this policy change in a triple diff strategy to examine whether shipping attributes changed after PNTR relative to before, for US buyers sourcing from China relative to from other countries, for products that were more affected by the change in the policy relative to products that were less affected. So let me just walk you a little bit through the details here. So the US has two basic tariff schedules. NTR tariffs are generally low and reserved for WTO members, and non-NTR tariffs are generally high. China's imports were allowed to enter the US under these lower NTR tariffs starting in 1980, but this regime required an annual vote from Congress, and these votes were actually quite contentious and uncertain for some of this period. PNTR came in 2001 and eliminated this need for this annual votes, basically fixing the tariffs permanently at this lower level. And so this is kind of a reduction in the probability of a trade war. If you think of a trade war as kind of this vote failing and tariffs rising to these really high non-NTR tariff levels. Crucially, the exposure to this change in the probability varies across products with what we call the NTR gap. It's a difference between the non-NTR rate and the NTR rate. And this gap actually varies substantially. So for some products, there's a large gap, meaning that a failed vote would have a substantial impact on the tariffs. Whereas for other products, these two are actually very similar. So you can think for these products, it doesn't actually matter if tariffs go up or not, they're kind of the same anyway. And we're going to exploit this variation across products in our analysis. So in terms of timing, we're going to look at two periods, a pre-PNTR period from 95 to 2000, and then a post-PNTR period from 2002 to 2007. And we're going to look at quintuples. So we're going to look at importer-exporter relationships for a given product, country, and mode that persist in both the pre and the post periods. That's kind of the closest to the theory. We're going to look at the same buyer buying the same product from the same seller before and after, and see whether the sourcing patterns changed in this post period. We're then also going to look at quadruples and even going to aggregate to the product level to triples to see whether this SPS measure changes consistent with the change in policy. So what do we want to test? Well, the model says that a lower arrival rate of trade wars induces buyers to switch from American-style to Japanese-style procurement. So we want to test this in the data. So basically what we're going to do is on the left-hand side, we're going to have our shipping attributes, the average shipping frequency, average price, and so on. And on the right-hand side, we're going to have a diff and diff term for the post-period, whether the import is from China, and the size of the NTR gap, which induces variation across products. We're going to have controls for the complete set of interactions of these variables that is needed to identify this beta 1 term. And again, we're going to hold quantity fixed as in the model. In robustness checks, we relax this and actually run this without this control, but this is just holding fixed, again, the total order size. And then we have quintuple fixed effects and time period fixed effects. So when we run this regression, we find that for these quintuples that are continuing, the ones that were particularly exposed to the change in policy in terms of having a relatively large NTR gap after this policy is passed and tariffs are permanently low, these quintuples lower their quantity per shipment, they reduce the number of weeks between shipments, and they increase the unit value that has to be paid from the US buyer to the seller. So this is consistent with the transition from the American to the Japanese system, where you order more frequently, but you have to pay this additional incentive premium. In the paper, we also look at relationships that are newly formed in the pre versus post period, and we find similar results for these. The final thing we do is we also go to the quadruple level and even to the triple level. So we just run the same regression at the quadruple level using two different variables. We compute this SPS ratio, the ratio of suppliers divided by number of shipments. And we compute a dummy for the Japanese system, J, that is equal to 1 if this SPS falls into the first quartile of the SPS distribution defined in the pre-period. So that's kind of this SPS is very low, it's in the first quartile. That's kind of indicative of Japanese style sourcing, where we fix this distribution in the pre-PNTR period. And for the triple level, we just average across importers. So we run this regression, and we do find that there's a reduction in suppliers per shipment and an increase in this likelihood of using the Japanese system. It's relatively imprecisely estimated at the quadruple level. It becomes more precise when we aggregate up to the triple level. This is kind of consistent again with the shift to the Japanese system. In the paper, we argue that it might take some time to shift systems from the American to the Japanese system. And so we try a later post period where we use a later time period from 2004 to 2009, and we show that these coefficients become more precisely estimated and more stronger. So the last thing we do is we perform some quantitative simulations. So how important is this Japanese style procurement? So we incorporate our model into a general equilibrium model of trade where Q is now endogenous. The challenge of doing this is that in our model, we have these fixed costs. And so standard competitive markets as an even quantum actually don't apply because we have economies of scale. They're downward sloping average and marginal cost curves. And so we impose a different market structure. We assume that buyers compete in contestable markets. This is an extension of Patron competition to markets with increasing returns to scale, and we solve the model under this alternative assumption to perfect competition. The sources of heterogeneity are the standard productivity channel, but now we also have trade war probability across country pairs and inspection costs, which vary across products. So comparative advantage in our model depends not only on productivity, but also on this policy uncertainty via firms' ability to have these relationship-based contracts under the Japanese system. So we estimate the model with 3 countries, US, China, and the rest of the world. And we parameterize this model using a mix of calibration and moment matching using our data from 1992 to 2016. In the baseline equilibrium, we find that about 10% of US imports from China arrive under the Japanese system, while from the rest of the world, it's about 50% because, well, the rest of the world contains, for example, Mexico, Canada, and so on. This higher Japanese share for the rest of the world relative to China is because there's, on average in our data set, a higher trade war probability with respect to China. And also the rest of the world, some of these countries like Mexico, Canada, and so on are relatively close to the US, and that actually pushes you to use the Japanese system, as we show. Now, the main policy experiment that we run is what happens if uncertainty rises so much that this Japanese style system is no longer possible. So you could think of next year, there's a big change in trade policy, and maybe these Japanese systems suddenly no longer become viable. What we find is that this no Japanese trade equilibrium is actually a third as costly as placing the US in autarky. The reason for this is that, first of all, some of the previous production that took place under the Japanese system shifts back to the US. So this is here in row 5, the share of consumption that's produced in the US increases, as some firms now basically reshore and make the stuff in the US rather than importing it from China. Second, some of these imports that were coming from the rest of the world under the Japanese system are now shifting to the American system. And some of these actually shift to China because China is very cheap. And so for some products, it actually makes sense to, rather than using American style sourcing from the rest of the world, use American style sourcing from China. And so eliminating this Japanese system in particular hurts the rest of the world because also a lot of this trade was under the Japanese system. So let me conclude. So we've developed a model that links procurement patterns to trade policy uncertainty. So as the probability of a trade war increases, importer-exporter pairs are less likely to form these long-term Japanese-style relationships. Our quantitative simulations point to a new channel by which tariff rate uncertainty reduces wealth. A higher uncertainty affects firms' choice of procurement system. And so in particular, if you eliminate Japanese relationships by increasing this uncertainty a lot, that can actually be a third as costly as autarky by forcing firms to no longer use this least cost Japanese system, instead forcing them to use this American system, which can be really costly for some goods where the inspection costs are really high. Thanks very much for listening.